recording. Perfect. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Prashasti, and I'm the editor-in-chief for the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal. We are so thrilled to have a fantastic group of panelists today who are all spotlighted for your convenience to explore and uncover the intersection of immigration and history as part of our inaugural scholar series for Immigration And. Immigration And is our new justice-oriented program, which is open to everyone, lawyers and non-lawyers, exploring interdisciplinary topics within immigration with a focus on justice and collective liberation. And I'll drop a link in our chat for our interactive syllabus and scholar series, so you can learn more about our panelists as well. And I'll be monitoring the chat throughout our time today, so please feel free to drop any questions, comments, or provocations during our discussion. We will take questions from you all towards the end. And now I will turn it over to our incredible staff editor, Hamsa, who will be moderating our discussion today. So
thank you
take
so
it
much,
away.
Prashasti. I really appreciate it, Prashasti. Yeah, we have an incredible panel today, and I wanted to ask them or invite them to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their work. And if maybe Carly Goodman can start us off, if that's okay with you.
I'll get us started. I have I'll talk about myself and then some general comments about the question about immigration and history. So I'm Carly Goodman. I'm a historian and I'm an editor at Made by History at the Washington Post. Previously, I've taught courses in US history, African-American history, immigration history, and also in some previous lives, I've worked at American Friends Service Committee as well as Human Rights First. I'm working on a book, submitted my manuscript, forthcoming with University of North Carolina Press, and that's on the subject of the US diversity visa lottery, grounded in the work that I did for my dissertation. The lottery is an immigration policy created in 1990 that admits people from countries that have sent relatively few immigrants to the United States. And it was created as a mechanism to admit Irish immigrants, but it has become an important channel for immigration from Africa. And I argue has renewed importance in our era of rising xenophobia and anti-Blackness in our immigration system. My next book, God willing, is on John Tanton and his network of anti-immigration organizations that have played a really decisive role in shaping immigration policy since the 1970s and really making immigration restriction palatable for a broader swath of the public. Probably the most important work that I do is editing at Made by History. We publish 11 historical analysis pieces every week, and I've had the pleasure and privilege to work with each of my co-panelists to help amplify their work and share it with public audiences beyond our scholarly networks that can be very narrow, so making that work accessible with the larger public. And I think, this work sort of sprang out of, during the Trump administration, historians had a moment where we had this capacity to explain the deep grooves in American history from which Trump sprang, to put him in this broader context, to dispel the notion that he represented an aberration or break with history. And I worked with scholars across fields who had a lot of insights into sort of that facet of the Trump presidency. But one area where I think we had the most to explain was in the realm of immigration, where Trump's presidency was perhaps at its most effective at achieving its policy goals. And we also saw this sort of outcry from the public, outrage, disgust, sorrow, as broader swaths of the public recognized the violence that the US government was implementing and using to immiserate vulnerable people, right? Asylum seekers, children, longtime members of our communities. And I really hadn't seen that much public outrage and public outcry since I think probably 2006 and the mass protests of that spring. I worried I think my co-panelists worried too that it was too easy for people to cast the cruelty as a particular Trump project. Now, he seemed to take particular pleasure in it, and his rhetoric was unusually open in its racism, but we all recognize that his nativism had deep roots in American history. We saw these cries, "This isn't who we are." Of course, this is part of who we've always been. So that was one element of it, but we also thought, I think, that viewing him as a break with history exonerated those who'd been active or complicit in building the machinery of restriction that he used to such efficient and effective, in such efficient ways. So amping up the existing public charge rule, endeavoring to detain children indefinitely, combining immigration enforcement and policing, narrowing the grounds for asylum seekers, and then especially during the pandemic, seeing the way that farm workers and immigrant workers in meatpacking plants, kitchens were sacrificed for the good of capitalism during the early pandemic and ongoing. So the project of cruelty against immigrants was long in the making, bipartisan, and as immigrants, advocates and organizers have long voiced, immensely inhuman and incredibly dangerous. And I think we did really good work trying to explain and contextualize this for the public, but I think we were also sadly right to recognize that the public would be eager to move on after the end of Trump's first term, to disengage on this issue and to sort of stop expressing that widespread outrage at policies that we know have continued, right? And so there's a lot of continuity, not only from the past to Trump, but then from Trump to Biden, where we see the extension of Title 42, the resumption of the Remain in Mexico program, detention of thousands of people, and the expulsion of thousands and thousands of Haitian people and others. So to me, this is why we need history, to recognize continuities and changes over time, to view what's happening through a historical rather than a partisan lens, and to remember that these policies and this stance that frames non-citizens as disposable or less are all imposed by people. And my fervent wish is that they can be undone and reimagined and remade by people as well.
Thank you so much, Carly. I'm not sure, do you want me to call you Carly, or would you like me to call you another honorific, Dr. Goodman, maybe?
No honorifics for me, just Carly.
Okay. Well,
and actually, I was going to say I'm going to drop some links to pieces by my co-panelists in the chat for people to check out if they'd like, some beautiful pieces that they wrote that I helped edit in some cases.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much for your introduction. If we could move on to Hidetaka Hirota, maybe you can give us also an intro, and we're trying to keep. Carly did such a great job keeping at 5 minutes, and that's the goal right here, so we can move along the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Hidetaka Hirota. Hamsa, you can just call me Hide, all right? Yeah, thank you. First of all, Prashasti, for inviting us to this panel, and then it's a real pleasure and actually an honor to be in the company of tremendous historian, extraordinary scholars here, whom I admire so much. Currently I'm teaching in Japan. I'm at the in the Department of English Studies at Sophia University in Tokyo, and I'm a historian of U.S. immigration apparently, and I specialize in the history of xenophobia, nativism, restrictive immigration law and policy in the US. And I think I'm in this panel, I'm the only 19th century Americanist. So I was trained as a 19th century Americanist, a historian of 19th century America. So my work to this date has focused on nativism, immigration law and policy in 19th century America, especially before the Civil War. And my first book was about the origins of American deportation policy, where America's removal, expulsion policies came from. That was the topic of my book, and I demonstrated how early state level immigration policy in New York and Massachusetts which was directed against the Irish poor. I demonstrated how such a state policy eventually laid the foundations for later federal immigration policy. And my current book, I'm currently working on a new book project, which is about the kind of tension between nativism against foreign workers and the practical demand for foreign labor in the US. And I think this is one of the fundamental questions, central themes in American immigration history, or maybe US history as a whole. And to trace its history, I kind of chronicle the history of the debate over contract labor, the importation of foreign workers, and how employers, business managers wanted their labor, but at the same time, the federal government and nativists tried and eventually failed to stop such an importation schemes. So that's what I'm working on now. And I guess I should say something about more like like Carly. Well, I'll just briefly say that I totally agree with Carly in that what has been happening for the last several years is no exception. It's really a part of a longer history. So historians have been really vocal to say that this is not who we are. Discourse is really misleading, as Carly said, and then everyone else in this field is saying, this is what the United States has been. What we're witnessing today. So again, and then I feel really strongly as well as the 19th century Americanist. If you look at nativism and immigration restriction, even before the Civil War, you see really similar patterns of restriction on the exploitation of immigrants and all related discourses. And you really realize how those things evolved, continued, developed for the last 2 centuries in the US. Anyway, I'll stop here, but I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hide. If we could move on also to Ivón Padilla-Rodríguez. Maybe you could give us a brief introduction.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hamza. And thank you so much, Prashasti, for inviting me to be here. I really echo Hide's gratitude, as I'm really honored to be participating in this panel with scholars that I really deeply admire. My name is Ivón. I'm a bridge to faculty postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm a legal and social historian of child migration. I'm in the early stages of working on a book manuscript on the child-centered consequences and mechanisms of US immigration exclusion. Mainly, my work traces the history of migrant child labor and trafficking, the school to deportation pipeline, and migrant child detention, as it related mostly to Mexican and some Central American youth in the 20th century. Outside of the academy, I've conducted research for the federal government and nonprofits in the US and Mexico on the migration of children, women, and families to the United States, and have also written on the topics in popular outlets. I actually have deep gratitude for Carly for being one of the first editors to provide me that opportunity. I'm committed to bringing historical knowledge and thinking to policymaking processes because I don't believe most immigration problems are wholly new or that they can or should be divorced from their historical context. I also don't think that we can properly address humanitarian immigration dilemmas without examining their roots and development over time. So that's really to say that I agree with what's already been said by my co-panelists, that some of the recent human rights violations against children and families that were seen as novelties perhaps were definitely not aberrational, nor were they solely say Republican inventions. They're part of a much longer bipartisan effort to exploit and expel immigrants. Lastly, I want to say that I am primarily brought to this work due to my personal lived experience as the daughter of formerly undocumented immigrants from Mexico, and the moral and ethical commitments to immigrant communities that I developed as a result of watching my mixed status family have to navigate an unjust US immigration system. Thanks again to everybody for signing into our Zoom this morning.
Thank you so much for giving us that background. And I'm really just excited to hear from all of you guys. But I want us to move on to Yael Schacher to give us a brief introduction, and hopefully we can then hop in and sort of have a discussion. We have a few questions and then we'll move on to the audience from there, but I'm really excited. All right, here you go. Passing it on to you, Yael.
Thanks, and you got my name perfectly. Thank you, Hamsa and Prashasti. And it's really an honor to be here, like everybody said. So I did a PhD in American Studies, focusing on the history of asylum in the United States, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I now work at Refugees International, which is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., advocacy focused on forced displacement and the problems of forced displacement around the world. And I guess, when I was an undergrad, I focused most of my attention on like finding the US radical tradition. Like that was my big focus. And then but I was also really interested in immigration history, and it was all about what people have said, the sort of oppressive ways that the state categorizes people and restricts who can enter the country, sovereignty and control over borders. And as everybody said, so much of this is not new. So much of what we're seeing now is not new and has been bipartisan, has been, developing over time in different ways. But what I did try to find were sort of, and I started working on a project on refugees and the discourse around protection, which was also sort of problematic and easily co-opted. So, protecting people, discourses around vulnerability and who deserves protection and who doesn't, it's also very easily co-opted and problematic. And it's usually also designed by the state, right? And deciding who's in, who's out, who deserves protection. And so part of what I discovered was that asylum, which I took courses on in the law school at Harvard when I was doing my PhD, and was sort of really galvanized and wrote my perspectives for my dissertation around the 2006 protests. So that's like very interesting to hear Carly mention that. And I was thinking like, wow, like I could probably find the voices of asylum seekers, not people who the state resettled and decided were vulnerable, but people who came here and said, I need protection. And they were saying it themselves. Like they didn't, and that is what I look for in my work, sort of how that developed over time. Migrants who came to the United States sort of on their own, right? Without, and because that's what it is, the state then had to deal with it. The state then had to figure out how to deal with it and devise different ways. So that's what my research has been about. And, in 2017, I decided I needed, since I studied asylum, and asylum was so under threat by the Trump administration. It was like its first line of attack was at the borders, shutting off asylum. I decided I had to like move into advocacy full time. But what I find now is that, the same problems exist, as Carly said, the same policies that the Trump administration sort of initiated regarding cutting off asylum are still in place, and, exacerbated by pandemic issues, but still very much in place. And that's because I really do think that we are now working, and maybe this is jumping the gun to one of the questions I will be discussing, but I do think we're working in a framework that, despite there being nothing new and a lot of the restrictions having developed over time, there were some important relatively recent turning points in the 1990s especially, and we're sort of living in a post-Cold War 1990s deterrence-oriented framework that is bipartisan, and we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how we can reimagine a new vision, because that is sort of the framework of today's policies, building on past structures around sovereignty and law, and ideas about who's deserving and who should be kept out and who's a drain on the economy, as Hidetaka was talking about. But still, that's sort of what I think I'm working towards, trying to think about reimagining. And some of my frustration in not getting the Biden administration to do the things we've asked, and I was very excited when he came in, hoping, and it's not working, has made me go back. I'm actually teaching at Georgetown this semester, and I'm hoping that what I can do in a poli-sci class is impart to some of my students that we have to actually think of these problems not as in a functional way, as problems to solve with, just working in the frameworks that we now have, but really thinking hard about how we define the problem. I think if we redefine the problem, we might actually come up with some new answers. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Yael. I think, I'm really excited to have this sort of conversation, and I'm going to ask about 4 questions, and then we're going to take it to the audience, but I invite the audience right now to drop in any questions they have in the chat, and Prashasti will send them to me, and I'll try to incorporate them in after we ask our 4 questions. So if you haven't already, and you have some burning questions to these panelists, I would do so now. So the first question that we have here is, we wanted to ask about what moments or forces of history have led us to this particular moment in immigration movements, both in terms of the ongoing exploitation of immigrants and the community-led efforts to close detention facilities. And I don't know if there's who wants to take it over first, but if anyone has kind of a burning answer, they can provide it right now.
I can start because I work on early periods, I guess. Historians love going chronologically, right? Well, I'm not really sure if this is a force of history, but I just, once again, as a historian of nativism and immigration restriction, I want to point out that one of the kind of constant themes in the history of American immigration policy or restriction is this idea of principle of police power, right? Police power is this principle or idea that any community has an inherent right to protect itself from external threats, whatever the threats were, and this principle or idea again proved to be such a flexible and handy tool to develop and justify or give legitimacy to immigration restriction policies. So the threats can be anything really. It can be in the colonial period. The threats were transient beggars. Like wandering paupers who would threaten the economy of the community. And then it could be in the 19th century. Those threats were Irish paupers. The immigrant poor. And also racial others such as Chinese. And then at the turn of the 20th century, European, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europeans were seen as another kind of threats. So threats could be racial, threats could be economic, threats could be biological, like immigrants carrying diseases, right? And then, in 20th century, 21st century, now terrorists, and then lately Muslims, so the United States and I think other nation states as well have adapted this idea of police power all the time to develop and legitimize immigration restriction policies. And that's something, I think that's kind of maybe, it's too basic for many of us here, but I think that's a kind of one of the founding, principles of everything, I guess.
I'm gonna hop in and do something unusual where I agree we actually do need more 19th century history, because my second part of this agreement is to agree with Yael and say the 1990s is where it's at, but I actually think more on the history of slavery and the laws and technologies of border control and control of people's movements, and like questions about citizenship and race are really I am a historian of the 1990s, so like, what am I doing? But a lot of the things that I've edited and read over the last year have me pointing more in this direction, to look at the foundations of racial capitalism in the United States, and to add to Hide's list of sort of people who are perceived to be threats, right? Is like, formerly enslaved people moving across, from the south to the north, and like the use of the fugitive slave laws to sort of use state power to control people's movements. And the other side of that would be also looking at histories of abolition, right? I think this has come up a lot, as in some of the discussions that we were having a few years ago about kids in cages. There was a lot of parallels, and we saw it more recently with the images of Border Patrol on horseback, thinking about, what the system of chattel slavery looked like, and what those systems of control looked like, and where we're seeing echoes of that today. And so the way that abolitionists built cases for the end of slavery, I think, have some interesting, they can be really helpful in helping us imagine different futures, because those are people in the past who imagined a future that, that they had to will into existence. But I want to talk more about the 1990s too.
Oh, sorry. I feel like now, after we heard Carly and Hide's comments, we're all now like bustling with ideas about the broad forces that brought us here. Hearing Hide talk about police power makes me think about the broad, like, legal and policy forces that brought us to this moment. I think first about how historically, since the era of Chinese exclusion, US immigration law became a really insulated body of law that diverges really significantly from constitutional norms, and it developed in a way that afforded the federal government really extraordinary, broad-reaching authority and discretion over immigration policy. Another overarching force that I think about, which I think is related to the first, has to do with the broad powers inherited by law enforcement officers who police the border against perceived external threats, namely the US Border Patrol, and more recently, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That the Border Patrol was given broad authority to interrogate, detain, and arrest any person they believed to be engaged in the act of unlawful entry in the 20th century. They were bestowed enormous authority since their inception. And of course, this enormous authority has also historically benefited from a long ingrained culture of impunity. And then just to pivot a little bit to moments or forces that have led us to this moment that I examined in my original research, I think about the efforts to reinforce, expand, and formalize immigration deterrence tactics that were born out of presidential administrations in the 20th century, both liberal and conservative. And I'm talking too about what I see as like prevention through deterrence in practice before it was formalized by the Border Patrol in the 90s. I have in mind specifically instances in history that relied on injuries to child and familial welfare. Again, commenting on this theme that we've all been talking about, how these kinds of tactics, particularly the ones that injure children and families, are not aberrational. In my own research, I analyze what I think are little known moments of immigrant family separation in the 70s and 80s to try to thwart post-1965 unauthorized migration across the US-Mexico border. Children were separated from their families in an effort to interrogate them about their smuggling into the United States. They were held as material witnesses, and this caused, widespread family separation of children and their parents in this period. I also look at how in the same period of migration during the late 20th century, educational deprivation was used as an experiment in immigration deterrence. And this was yet another effort at establishing child welfare as an arena where immigration deterrence and exclusion can be kind of experimented and mapped out. So to put it in other words, both individual states and the federal government have been experimenting with how to use injuries to child and familial welfare in order to deter unauthorized migration for decades.
Wow. Okay. So a lot's been covered, but I guess I would just say, I think to agree a little bit with Ivón and Hide and Carly, I guess too, is that I actually think the law is important. The idea that deportation, late 19th century idea in US law that deportation is not really a punishment. And but I don't like, but like people who enter without authorization are criminals. And that combination of things means that you can criminalize immigrants and you don't really care what happens to them if you expel them, right? Like there's they're criminals, but they deserve no compassion. What happens to them, out of sight, out of mind kind of idea, like get rid of them without any rights. And I was listening to a hearing today about Title 42 this morning, litigation hearing, and the argument that the Biden administration was making was that because Title 42 is this bar on border is this an expulsion policy at the border because of COVID? The argument that the government's lawyer was making was that because that doesn't leave like a consequence on your record, because now if you try to enter without inspection in the United States, you can't come back for 10 years. It's like the removal, right? The removal, if you have a removal order, you're barred from admission, that consequence for illegal entry. So because there's no criminalization of the entry and there's no record, there's no consequence, we don't care like expulsion is no big deal either. Like that was literally the argument. We can expel you because we're not criminalizing you. I mean, so you see how these issues are so tied together. The fact that immigrants are both criminals who need to be kept out, policed out, and they really are treated like slaves in many ways. They are, without humanity, right? And the consequences of treating them poorly and with inhumanity is really not of concern. And I think that that's just a profound dichotomy that structures the way our system really works and allows for so much indifference. And I agree with Carly's idea. The first chapter in my research, my dissertation that will hopefully soon be a book, or soon in an ever receding future will be a book, is about people precisely who contested in the late 19th and early 20th century this idea that we should just treat immigrants in the paradigm I just laid out. And they drew very much on the history of abolition and the idea that you can't treat people, and the idea of, against thinking of some of the new immigration laws as, the extradition laws as essentially fugitive slave laws in many ways, like looking at them as very similar. So yeah, we do need to look to people like that, for inspiration on how to shift out of this paradigm.
Thank you so much, Yael, and the rest of the panelists for sort of giving us a foundation, a historical sort of foundation where we can move the conversation along. I think it's really important to understand these sort of the forces, and the different ideas that you guys have for the different forces that brought us to this sort of immigration moment. One of the questions we wanted to ask was, in addition to these like large trends that you mentioned, what sort of histories still remain unknown to us, or rather unknown to the larger predominant public, and why do those histories remain unknown? For instance, like we may reflect on sort of the history of climate forced migration, which is not a well-researched topic or one that is highly discussed. However, it's becoming increasingly prominent within the advent of adverse climate events and gradual climate processes. I think just from hearing from some of the panelists, we can also, some of the histories that you've also reflected on are not ones that are maybe predominantly well known or thought of in that particular way. I'm thinking about, I think he's had some work on talking about how there's sort of been more so economic concerns for immigration policies, reflecting on, I think you had a book talking about expelling the poor, and how you make an argument about how New York and Massachusetts in the late 19th century was actually had concerns regarding poverty rather than racism when they were when they had discrimination against Irish immigrants. So anyways, I'm just babbling on here, but I think everyone can kind of reflect upon maybe one type of historical moment that's really not known within immigration.
Okay, I'll start. Very briefly speaking, well, let me simply put, issues of immigration restriction and the policy consequences of nativism in the 19th century, especially before the Chinese exclusion law, remain unknown at this point yet. And the reason why it can be a historiographical problem, that is modern scholarship, historical scholarship on immigration restriction or deportation policy, started with Chinese exclusion, which is a federal policy introduced in the late 19th century. And that was actually a rightful start. There's nothing wrong with that. And Chinese exclusion law was very important and pivotal, especially for its racial focus. But at the same time, precisely because of the importance of Chinese exclusion, historians of immigration policy have really overlooked what was going on in the US before Chinese exclusion in terms of immigration restriction, or again, the policy consequences of nativism. And the result was what we call the open borders myth. That is, before Chinese exclusion, America's borders were kind of wide open to everyone. But there is an exciting research going on in terms of how regulations of international movement and domestic movement, those regulations were operating organically. And Carly mentioned earlier this connection between immigration control, issues of immigration and African American history, including fugitive slave law or the debate over slavery. There are some cutting edge researches on this topic actually presently. Pre-Chinese exclusion, immigration restriction is I think there should be more work on this topic. Also, Pierre.
I sort of have two comments on your question. One, it's not that the history remains unknown, but I think we have to think about how historically grounded the categories are. Like the impulse to sort migrants into categories of deserving and undeserving, I think, is something that Yael was talking a lot about, and I think it underlies all of the questions that we're asking today, and I think it's a big problem. But also thinking about sort of the Cold War roots of the refugee system and how we've defined who is deserving, and how those categories, I think, are not necessarily like reflective of the world's needs, nor are they serving even the communities that they were sort of designed to serve. So that's something that history can help us recognize, is that these are not, these categories are constructed, and we should rethink them. And so economic migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, climate refugee, I'm not sure that we move towards a more humane world by just adding categories. The other thing that I want to think about, that I don't know if this is what you had in mind, but we're seeing this accelerating, climate instability, and we've already had a preview of the Right's climate change plan, which is walls, migrant camps, right? This is the Right's climate action plan, is exclusion and a kind of embrace of lifeboat ethics. And so we're seeing this rise of sort of green fascism. And we also, I think, have to grapple with the white supremacist roots in conservation and environmentalism itself. This is one of the fascinating things about John Tanton's story. He's the founder of FAIR and the Center for Immigration Studies, and really the New York Times called him the puppet master behind the anti-immigration movement. And it arose from his environmentalism and his environmental activism, which was dovetailing in the 1960s and 70s with a population control movement, where it was sort of a revival of earlier ideas about unruly populations. Population growth concerns are always sort of imbued with eugenic logics and racism. And these, I think, have really come to the surface during the COVID pandemic in disturbing ways. So we're going to see a lot more of this as things get worse. And it's really important to recognize those logics, which are sometimes invisible, you know, to good liberals or to my students. That are being activated here with really, really, really troubling consequences.
I'm happy to go next. I think it's pretty abundantly clear that everybody on this panel here is doing really important work on little known histories, in addition, of course, to a lot of exciting scholarship that's probably going to come out in the next few years, providing additional context for recent moments of immigration that lack historical context. But first, I'll talk about what I know most, which is child migrants. We know very little about them historically. Historical scholarship on immigration is overwhelmingly adult-centric, because historians rely pretty heavily on archives to tell history, and children don't leave behind their own records in most cases, much less the poorest and most marginalized among them who are actively trying to avoid detection by law enforcement and welfare officials. There's a paucity of firsthand accounts from children in institutional archives, and that's been in some cases misinterpreted to mean that children didn't cross borders. But I think another reason why the history of child migrants is obscured and we view their border crossings as new is because even in history, migrant youth, especially teenagers, were adultified by law enforcement. They were seen as migrants first, then workers if they labored, because a lot of these children did labor, and children last. So in the historical record, it can be really difficult to distinguish who was a minor because of how murky the boundaries between childhood and adulthood were, since law enforcement and other hostile US officials likened migrant youth to adults, and also because migrant youth carried out responsibilities that appeared very adult-like, and that more privileged families generally reserved exclusively for those who were legally considered adults. But I also think that the long-held assumptions about who undertakes migration, who gets confined in detention for prolonged periods of time, and who works surreptitiously in contradiction of the law have also impacted efforts to even begin to try to investigate the border crossings of minors. And just to add, of course, I agree that I think that the history of climate migration is under-examined, although I know that Maria Cristina Garcia at Cornell is going to come out with a book soon on this topic. And I think also the full extent of the Border Patrol's authority and racial violence, including its historic partnership with police departments, also has room for additional scholarship. There's pioneering work by Kelly Hernandez on the Border Patrol. I also think that more work on the history of detention and asylum, which is going to come out in the next few years, is going to be really important to our discussions about these topics.
Thanks. Yeah, if I could just echo, I mean, I recently saw a letter by a bureaucrat in 1970s who is, someone wrote to him about, can we, it was an INS, a person who worked for the Immigration Naturalization Service, can we find a way under the current immigration laws to allow people into the country who are leaving because of a natural disaster? And the response was, well, that's never really been done in our law, so no. And it gets this idea that, well, if it's not recognized legally by a category, then it hasn't really been thought about, even if it's been a motive for migrating for a long time, right? So this idea that you just have to not think in terms of the necessarily the categories that are already used. And that's really, really hard. And for me, when I started researching, I got the big law school casebook on asylum. And I started just reading all the asylum cases, right? Okay. And what I noticed was that, different groups of people that you might actually group in different ways were categorized based on like what ground of protection they were seeking, rather than, let's say, I don't know if they were all students or they all were, there was a different, more logical way of actually categorizing them socially, beyond the categories. So I think part of it is getting away from that, and it makes it hard to see historical trends because they're obscured by the legal categories that people are put in, which is very, very hard. It's kind of what Ivón was talking about. Like, you can't see who's crossing because they're categorized and then they disappear. And the other thing is just like, we don't have enough archives, especially the official archives from the federal government. Like, this is a hobby horse of mine. So sorry, I'll just talk for a second about it. But like, as several people have said, the on the ground decisions of bureaucrats and Border Patrol have huge consequences. And just looking at like legislative debates or law on the books, as lawyers know about, like, is not going to tell you that much about what actually happens on the ground. And there's been a lot of good scholarship already on this, but like, for me, one of the archives that I'm trying to get to like cleave out of the government is the records, the history of the immigration courts, which is not part of the judiciary branch, it's part of the executive branch, and it's just very hard to get. We have just a sample, a small public record sample of like the decisions by immigration courts and by the Board of Immigration Appeals, but we have nothing else. There's not a really good archive of that, and that's what the everyday experience is of people in the system, right? And so in order to understand like how individual immigrants are affected by policy, you really need to get those granular cases. And without the archive, and you have to go to like individual lawyers to cash them down, but it would be so much easier if we actually had the records. And the lack of transparency from the government, like Ivón was talking about with the Border Patrol, and the lack of transparency makes that history hard to uncover.
Thank you so much, Yael, and the rest of the panelists for your contributions to this particular question. I think it's good information for the audience to hear about these little histories that we haven't heard of before. I think I will try to combine the last two questions because we're kind of running out of time. The first question we had is that it's sort of difficult to have this conversation without acknowledging the devastating pandemic, which is called upon immigrants to be essential while risking their lives and futures. So we wanted to ask, in what ways has the current treatment of immigrants during the pandemic a repetition of the past? And then our final question, which is sort of bringing all of these discussions together, is how can we use this history to sort of dream of a liberation and imagine a just future? One where I guess like policy stakeholders and potential activists, and also potential activists, and we have a lot of law school students on this conversation, can use in the future, in light of all your reflection upon the history of immigration, and also your work on immigration. So sort of just kind of a question to help individuals in the audience and us in general to think about what we can do to help in remedying this immigration policies. And I know Yael is working on this fervently, and maybe sort of hopefully with change, but we can't be too hopeful about this constantly moving and changing and unfortunate immigration policies within the Biden administration. But yeah, if the panelists can help us with those two questions, that would, in the last 10 minutes of the meeting, I would be super grateful.
I'll make a very brief response to the essential worker question real quick. So the title, the adjective being essential, and the recognition that they were essential is an interesting point, because yes, in reality, immigrants have been doing essential jobs for the development of the U.S. By risking their lives and futures, and that there's nothing new here. I mean, so for example, in the 1830s or 40s, Irish immigrants were canal diggers. Canal digging is probably the most dangerous and harshest jobs in America at the time. And then later, Chinese workers built the transcontinental railroad with enormous self-sacrifice. And what they did was all essential to the U.S. For the U.S. And then those were kinds of labor were really dangerous. But then they were not really considered essential in wide American public. Maybe the employers or business owners thought that they were essential to their profits, but beyond this business circle, their labor wasn't really considered essential by most Americans. So this is a kind of point of continuity or change. If today's workers were really considered essential, that may be called progress. So they earned the recognition that their work was labor, but at the same time, we have to ask how sincere you are when you say they were essential. If society forces them to continuously risk their lives, futures. So, I think this adjective essential is a point of debate. And then here we see we can really examine whether or not today's situation is continuity or the result of change. Anyway, I'll just shut up here.
I guess I'll jump in. Really, it's the second question I'm thinking about is sort of like, how do we imagine a different future? And I think about something that I see coming out of immigrant rights advocacy that tries to make a case for immigrant contributionism, like sort of celebrate immigrants because they've built this nation, because of their essential work, because of their contributions. And I think that this kind of message can, it's well supported with data, immigrants are good, blah, blah, blah. But it's so dehumanizing, right? To break people down into their role as economic actors. And it's part of a continuity of trying to sort of say, well, we can create sort of some protections, right, for the good immigrants. We can sort of welcome the good immigrants and keep the bad immigrants out. We can have the people who aren't criminals, right, but we have to keep the criminals out. That sort of, ignores the way that we know that the criminal justice system is structurally racist, that we know that these systems ensnare people in in all of these ways. And so, I don't know, I think just sort of rejecting some of that framework to say, like, actually, we all deserve to be safe and cared for, like, regardless of where we were born, regardless of our productivity in the capitalist system. I mean, it's a moment where I think a lot of workers across fields, across class are recognizing that we've been sold a kind of false bill of goods. And so is this an opportunity to recognize how our humanity is bound up with each other? And how letting the vulnerable, letting any of us be mistreated threatens us all, right? And we're in danger of sort of losing something here. So, immigration policy can be a very niche technical thing. I have to ask my immigration lawyer husband questions all the time, like, oh my God, so many weird things in immigration law, but this isn't actually like a niche policy issue, right? This is like the terrain upon which the existential questions about our country and the planet are being sort of fought and waged. And there's no way to approach this without seeing our shared humanity and without putting that front and center.
Oh, I feel like this keeps happening. I really appreciate that Carly commented on the second question about how to look to history to try to achieve a more just history. I think two of the things that we can do is to look at how immigrants in the past advocated for themselves, both in the long past and also the recent past, and also how outsiders have advocated historically for immigrants, because I think in looking at these historic campaigns, you can assess both pitfalls and also advantages of like well-meaning advocates who advocate on behalf of immigrants. I do not think that we can achieve migrant justice without seriously incorporating the voices, the ideas, and the insights of those who are most directly impacted by unjust immigration systems. If we look to history, I think we can learn from both the explicit and subtle forms of protest that immigrants enacted in order to advocate for themselves. When it comes to children, they participated in legible forms of protest, like labor strikes, court litigation, social protests, but they also did things like they ran away from their labor traffickers, they ran away from detention. They did really interesting things to challenge state authority. And then when we look at how well-meaning outsiders advocated for immigrants in the past, one of the examples from my own research I wanted to bring up is how in the late 20th century, there were these advocates who were trying to improve educational access for migrant youth, and their well-meaning efforts, it's a very long story, but their well-meaning efforts ended up creating this like data collection technology that jeopardized the privacy of undocumented students and their parents. And I think that can show us a little bit about how sometimes even like inclusion can be a little bit perilous, and that in and of itself can have insidious consequences. But there was also a moment in that movement where advocacy for immigrants eschewed ideas about belonging, about legal belonging, in that they challenged the legitimacy and the immorality of legal status requirements. And I think that by imagining alternatives to legal belonging, I think that also can help us imagine a more just future.
Well, that was awesome. I mean, I just do what Ivón said, but also, one of the things I try to do is because I come from a slightly although I'm an advocate now, right? I'm in this movement now for pushing for immigrant rights. I feel like I have the historical perspective, so I do try to make the actors involved in these movements sort of self-aware about exactly what those pitfalls might be, and about some of the more, it seems like it's a good line of argument or a good thing to say, but wait, has anybody said that before, and what might have happened as a result? So it's a good reminder to just be really self-aware about the kinds of strategies that you're using, and look to the past for good ideas and possible mistakes you want to avoid.
Thank you so much, and also the rest of our panelists. I want to thank you all. I want to thank first the panelists for joining us and for having these conversations, especially without pay and amid a pandemic. I'm sorry that we have to cut the conversation short, but we have to keep on the time and to keep things moving. But we will have more conversations and discussions in future events. I also want to thank the Immigration Law Student Association for co-sponsoring our event. And I want to remind everyone to join us for our future events. Prashasti is actively sending, or she has sent in the discussion below about all of our future events, and especially the one coming up on February 8th. Immigration and settler colonialism. And yeah, I also want to encourage our audience to support all the panelists' work, especially I know I've seen some panelists drop in some points in the chat. So that's and also to help donate to our mutual aid to support immigration-focused law students. All the links are in the chat, and Prashasti will also drop resources to share. And also link to the mutual aid and to our next events in the chat. And also she'll follow up with information about all of this through an email. So thank you so much for everyone for joining, and especially our panelists and our sponsor. I wish everyone to have a great rest of their day, and to enjoy their classes if if they're a student at the law school. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.